Welcome now to our 7th lecture on the origin of species. In this lecture, I will be introducing some of the issues involved in the reception of Darwin's theory of evolution after Darwin. So we'll look in this lecture at issues of scientific reception and briefly discuss some of the intersection between Darwinian ideas in biology and ideas in politics. And then we will wrap up next time with a brief discussion of the connection between Darwin and religion. So after the publication of The Origin of Species, almost all serious biologists were persuaded of the theory of common origins, what Darwin continues to call descent with modification. However, Darwin's claim that natural selection is the primary mechanism for achieving adaptation and differentiation in a world of common descent is not widely accepted in the 19th century. Throughout the 19th century, you see various alternatives that are much more dominant views in the scientific community. The two big families of such views are what are called saltationist views and mutationist views. So saltationism is the idea that in certain periods, something in the environment causes the rate of variation to increase rapidly. And by increasing that rate of variation, increases the selective pressure and generates rapid changes in the makeup of the populations. The other alternative is mutationist theories. Now, mutationism, the easiest way to understand classical mutationism is to think about the X-Men from Marvel comic books, or mutants in comic books. The idea that there are sort of one-step, big changes that generate radical transformations in organisms. And that is the primary driver of evolution. So notice both of these, right, what they don't share with Darwin is his commitment to gradualism. Right? They each, in their own way, in fact, to hark back to the very first lecture, preserve the catastrophism in geology that Darwin and Lyell are opposed to there. You also have one other alternative in play, widely in play, various ideas about the way in which perhaps God guides the evolutionary process. So not denials of common descent, but the idea that the process has some goal or purpose, which hopefully, for these thinkers, might actually be something that human beings will be able to discern. We'll talk a bit about theistic evolution in the next lecture. So how then do we get to the modern theory of evolution, which is Darwinian in the strong sense, that is committed to gradualism and the dominance of natural selection? Well, that really happens in the generation after Darwin. And probably more technically, the second generation. So, for example, on the first slide of this lecture, there's a picture of Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, with his grandson, Julian Huxley, the editor of our edition of The Origin of Species, and one of the three dominant figures in the establishment of the neo-Darwinian synthesis. So how does that go about? Well, various things happen. A bunch of major mathematical discoveries are made. That is, it becomes possible to turn Darwin's relatively impressionistic account of natural selection into an actual, I'm going to say for this audience, Cartesian mathematical set of equations that determine what's going on in evolutionary settings. And that then generates, right, with the intersection between the adoption of what we now call Mendelian genetics, and how we get to modern genetics is a complicated story in its own right. But for our purposes, right, Dobzhansky, who we mentioned earlier, is a major figure in this, and his Genetics and the Origin of Species is one of the most important books in establishing modern theories of Darwinian evolution. We then have Julian Huxley's major work, Evolution, the Modern Synthesis. Thus, we now call modern theory of evolution the Neo-Darwinian synthesis. And Ernst Mayr, Systematics and the Origin of Species. So notice, right, we've got this explicit callback to Darwin in 2 out of 3 of these. And of course, Huxley, who grew up essentially as a member of the family with Darwin. The Huxleys and the Darwins were extremely close. Nobody does not need to call out his connection to Darwin. So this is what generates the modern biology and biological theory of evolution that you learn about in modern evolutionary biology classes. So notice it's quite late, well after Darwin's own death. What else is going on with Darwinian evolution here? Well, the other place where Darwin has a huge influence, for good or ill, most people would probably say more for ill, is in the way in which people think about politics, right? The so-called social Darwinism controversies. And it's worth noting that social Darwinism is not an actual movement. No one ever called themselves a social Darwinist in the 19th century. That's a historian's term for certain political ideas that they discern looking backwards into the 19th century. But Darwinism does get tangled up with eugenics. This is probably the one where a certain amount of blame of Darwin himself is most warranted. Probably the most significant voice in favor of eugenics in the 19th century was Darwin's cousin Francis Galton, with whom he was close and in cooperation on other issues. We then get this idea of social Darwinism, right? This takes the idea of survival of the fittest and applies it in a social context and says, well, if you can't succeed, then that's all for the best of everyone, right? We select out unfit people. Again, it's very hard to find anyone in the 19th century defending these particular views as an idea that we should organize society so as to pick out particular views, particular traits, other than in the case of the eugenics arguments. And you also then get this applied in the international realm to ideas that successful colonial powers have the right to their success precisely because they are more fit than those they are conquering. I think it's really important to be clear. You can't get any of this out of the biology. None of it follows from Darwin's arguments in The Origin of Species, or in his treatments of the evolution of human beings more generally in his later career. It just doesn't work that way. You have two problems. One is you simply can't get a should from a could, ever. And the other is that all of these social Darwinian kinds of arguments rely on something that Darwin explicitly denies in The Origin of Species, that artificial selection, that is conscious selection by human beings, is a better alternative to merely natural selection. Darwin, in fact, spends a lot of effort arguing the opposite, that nature's operation is much more subtle and much more important than artificial selection. That artificial selection tends to reduce, in fact, overall fitness in favor of particular views of what we want people to possess. However, it is worth noting there is rather a shortage of liberal Darwinians in the 19th century. So a liberal Darwinian might be someone who says, in order to maximize the success of human beings, what we really need is to maximize the range of talents that we are open to. Maximize the variation, Maximize our openness to everything that is happening in the world and allow it just to fall out the way that it does. Not to impose from the top down our vision of what is better or worse. Those people are few and far apart on the ground in the 19th century. And perhaps the best place to look at this is, for example, here. So this chapter, this paragraph, is from a book called Civic Biology. That is the book that was at issue in the Scopes monkey trial, dramatized in the play and film Inherit the Wind. Or we also have this one, also from Hunter's Civic Biology. It's worth noting, this is what William Jennings Bryan, who was the assistant prosecutor, technically he was an outsider, but a very important political figure. This is what Bryan objected to in the teaching of evolution. Not what we would think of as sort of simple, straightforward biological issues. It's precisely these claims about human beings that led to the rejection of Darwinian ideas among a lot of religious and political thinkers at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. So I'm just going to leave you with that and turn next time to the question of what does the acceptance and adoption of a theory of evolution tell us, or more significantly, not tell us about religion and whether we should believe in God.